Hello again. My name is Michael Paul Hurd. I am the owner of Lineage Independent Publishing and author of my Lineage series of historical fiction novels. Welcome to the third episode of my series. I hope the audio quality is better for this presentation than it was for the previous two. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about the storyline in Iniquity and Retribution Lineage Series Book 3. The latest edition of the book was published in mid-2021. This podcast is recorded, but I still invite you to ask questions or make comments in the appropriate interface on Facebook, YouTube, or Substack, and I will respond as soon as possible. Iniquity and Retribution opens in the middle of a murder trial in 1894. The defendant, a woman, has been accused of murdering her husband. In the back of the courtroom, her 10-year-old son is watching the proceedings, not really understanding what is going on. Ultimately, the trial ends with the judge issuing a nolle prosequi finding on the lack of evidence to convict the defendant, Ophelia Smith. That finding left open the possibility of the case being reopened without double jeopardy, as would have been the case with a dismissal or a verdict of not guilty. In the book, I do tell who committed the murder, but to reveal that here would really be a spoiler. After a year-long restriction on leaving town expires, Ophelia packs up and moves herself and her two young sons to Jeffersonville, about 200 miles away. In Jeffersonville, Ophelia resumes her old ways, using her body as currency, and entertains a constant stream of the town's wealthier men, each of whom shower her with gifts or lines of credit at their businesses. In the late 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, the concept of a kept woman, a euphemism for mistress, was a tolerated practice among the well-to-do. Eventually, Edward, the one who had been watching his mother's trial, reaches adolescence and figures out what his mother has been up to. When she marries the wealthiest man in town, Edward quickly falls victim to his verbal and physical abuse. Edward is scarred for life. The situation is complicated by Ophelia getting pregnant, to which Edward responds with overwhelming jealousy. Eventually, Edward takes steps, telling you what they were would be another spoiler, to end his mother's pregnancy. Ophelia eventually rekindles an old flame with a previous lover who, coincidentally, was present when her first husband was killed and disappears just after Edward graduates from high school, leaving Edward and his brother Gaylord to fend for themselves against their abusive stepfather who, having been accustomed to the rich bachelor lifestyle before the marriage, abandons the home and files for divorce on the grounds of desertion. By the time the divorce is granted, Edward was already a street corner soapbox preacher, speaking out against the social evils of the day, and especially against adultery and alcohol. He quickly drew a following, as well as developing a Jekyll and Hyde personality, caused by two overpowering sleep disorders. Edward eventually becomes an itinerant preacher and finds full-time employment with the railway mail service, and I couldn't resist briefly taking the story through Marceline, Missouri, which Disney fans should recognize. The combination of the two vocations provides Edward with access to a willing congregation and a youngish woman who is caught up in Edward's fire and brimstone preaching. After a very unconventional courtship, they get married. Edward continues his preaching on the railway circuit, while his bride Millicent finds a career of her own as a social worker who, in the 21st century, probably would have been terminated from employment for forcing her very narrow life views on her charges. On the mail trains, Edward is passed over for promotion to supervisor and enlists in the army out of spite, neglecting to inform Millicent of his action. She was livid. Over time, Edward's sleep disorders take control of his life, and a series of mishaps sully his reputation. Millicent eventually figures out that Edward has been involved in the mishaps and exacts her revenge after he returns from fighting in World War I, suffering from what was then known as shell shock and today is known as post-traumatic stress disorder. This storyline was inspired by the murder of my paternal great-great-grandfather and the personas of one set of my paternal great-grandparents. The murder of my great-great-grandfather, Ira Hurd, on September 22, 1894, was never solved, despite his wife Lizzie and her alleged lover both being arrested and put on trial. The scandalous murder and subsequent trial in southwestern Michigan were picked up by national newspapers such as the Washington Post and even the German language newspaper in Baltimore. In the end, though, the paramour was acquitted and the case against Lizzie nol prost for lack of evidence to support the charge of murder. Meanwhile, the personalities of Edward and Millicent Smith were, according to an octogenarian cousin with first-hand knowledge, spitting images of my great-grandparents. Interestingly, I had already written most of the book before sharing it with the cousin. He was amazed at how I unknowingly captured their personalities. My own childhood encounters with my great-grandmother in the 1960s and 1970s were, from what I remember, pretty strange. She made it perfectly clear that she did not drink, that Protestants and Catholics, as well as different races, should not mix or intermarry, and that children should be seen and not heard. She voiced this narrow-mindedness on the church speaking circuit in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, repeatedly attributing juvenile delinquency to broken homes, lack of moral training, low mentality, extreme poverty, and children left to their own devices. I think she may also have ascribed to the old adage of spare the rod and spoil the child, but I can't confirm that. Funny thing though, she never mentioned love in any of her diatribes. Over the past few minutes, I provided an overview of the history behind Iniquity and Retribution, the third novel in my Lineage series, which does not have to be read sequentially. There are currently 10 books in the series, and an 11th is on the way. I hope you've enjoyed the high-level overview and appreciate the depths of research done by a historical fiction author. For Lineage Independent Publishing, I'm Michael Paul Hurd. Thanks for watching.